So now we have Stellan. Stellan is a professor of sociology and the inaugural endowed sharing the study of nonviolent direct action and civil resistance at the University of Massachusetts. He has since 1980 been an educator, organizer, and activist, participating in numerous nonviolent civil disobedience actions for which he has served a total of more than 1 year in prison. He was a member of the WRI Council between 2006 and 2019. And one of his books is a theory of nonviolent action, how civil resistance works. So yeah, I give you the floor to Stellan and your presentation. Thank you, Stellan.
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you so much, Sarah and Carrie, for what you were saying. I'm glad to see that we are very much thinking along the same lines. I will also talk about how anti-militarist work needs to connect to other movements, because militarism is influencing so much of how politics, economy, and our relationship to each other and nature is being formed in our imperialist, colonial, patriarchal, racist world, right? So, and I think that that's one of the strengths of the War Resistance International, that it's organization that understands that there are these root causes to war. It's not just the wars being fighting, but it's the militarism that builds it up. But I will focus more on the connection between anti-militarism and the climate change, or the climate crisis and the mobilization for climate justice. So I don't know if you noticed, but recently the leader of NATO, our dear Norwegian Stoltenberg, recently declared that now also NATO and the military will have to be fossil neutral and climate responsible. Some years ago, the Green Party members in Europe suggested catalytic converters on military tanks, and an ecological awareness of how to collect and reuse the lead from bullets used in training and exercises. Is that a way forward for militarism? Well, I think we need to remember that historically, the war departments have successfully converted themselves into defense departments and made imperialist and colonial wars into a responsibility to protect, they call it, or humanitarian interventions or regime change. And the feminist critique has led to incorporation of women in the armed forces in places like the US, Norway, and Eritrea. And now it seems to be the time for the military to become climate smart and ecological as well. I think there is an inherent weakness in anti-militarist activism, because we are very often having a lot of small groups and organizations that carry out the work, develop creative ideas and sustain the structures and keep the knowledge alive in periods of low mobilization. That has been really important, but a key to periods of mass mobilization, shaping its direction and providing tools inherited from previous struggles, really important. But these mass mobilizations have tended to happen in relation to particular outrageous wars. And the strength of the War Resistance International, as I see it, is that it tries to mobilize against the root causes of war, not just the imminent or ongoing war that is capturing the media attention right now, but that is also the weakness, the challenge of War Resistance International. How do you sustain a movement that struggle against the militarism that is preparing for the next mass killing? But it's right now, it doesn't look like something is happening. What do you do then? Like in the country I come from, Sweden, although I work in the US, Sweden has had so-called peace for 200 years, but participate in military interventions like in Afghanistan and export a lot of weapons to a lot of wars around in the world. So how do you mobilize them? Well, the broader anti-militarist movement has achieved a lot, I think. Stopped wars sometimes, ended them earlier, and made wars to seem less patriotic. The anti-militarist movement has also created more regulations with international laws and almost eradicated the classical war between two states. But wars have not become less deadly or less likely to happen. Today, there are instead internationalized civil wars, proxy wars with private or secret state armies acting on behalf of other states. And the military preparation for war gets more and more high-tech and run by machines in distant places. At the same time, militarism as an ideology, way of practice, informs private security, border control, policing, and a range of other previously civil matters, right? Militarism is everywhere nowadays. The need for a deep and broad critique of militarism, such as the one done by the War Resistance International, is even more necessary today. And the de facto reality of waiting for mass mobilization in times of acute war threats is simply not good enough. It does not work against the impact of militarism. So how do you mobilize around the relative abstract threat of war in a society when war is not an imminent threat, but where the state spend too much money on preparing for war, a state that militarize our society, that build bases, that recruit young people and brainwash them, that modernize and perfect their weapons, and that are training and exercising for future wars? To me, the only way forward is to work in broad alliances with other struggles where we are seeing connections to militarism, like climate struggles against the fossil industry, environmental and indigenous struggles against mining and resource exploitations, anti-racist struggles against the militarization of the police, anti-sexist struggles against sexual violence as military bases, liberation struggles against authoritarian regimes in the world, and so on. It's only by being the ones that show the connections to militarism, the militarization and national security framework of issues like migration, relations to other states, to indigenous people, to nature, to education, to crime, etc., that we are going to be able to sustain anti-militarism in the spirit of the War Resistance International, I think. I mean, if we think about it, the climate crisis is robbing people of livelihoods. And of course, it's going to create a lot of human insecurity. And of course, it's going to create a lot of migration. And of course, it's going to be connected to militarization of borders, as Carrie and Sarah was talking about, right? That's what's going to happen. And War Resistance International needs to be then connected to these kind of struggles. Anti-militarism needs to be something that is seen in a much broader sense than fighting against particular wars. And if we are in alliance with partners in a wide range of struggles, where there are anti-militarist links, we can and shall influence the vision, strategies, and tactics of these movements, making them more aware not just of the dangers of militarization of policy, politics, economy, and culture, but also how we can adopt an anti-militarist vision to our struggles, can embody, prefigure, and build a different society, one formed by justice and peace, the human dignity of every human being, and a way of life. So if this sounds like it's reasonable, what I'm saying, it has a couple of consequences for the future, for sustaining of our anti-militarism, and I'm taking out 3 points here. Number one is, I think that we need to constantly improve and develop our understanding of and an ability to pedagogically explain how a militarist worldview, ideology, and practice informs different problems and injustices in our world, how it forms the mainstream view on criminal policy and incarceration, for example, on the treatment of migrants and so-called illegals, on consumption, sexuality, family relations, and our relationship to nature. Number two is that we need to find ways of working that build networks, relations, and alliances for the long run with a really broad set of movements and issues. Number three is that also Carrie and Sarah was talking about before, we need to find ways of sustaining ourselves for this very long struggle, one that is tied to all these movements that we are connecting ourselves to. So the most promising mass mobilization of people in a system critical movement today is clearly the climate justice movement, I would say. That is where a sustainable anti-militarism needs to be today. That means to connect to indigenous communities on the front lines and direct action campaigns like Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, and Ende Gelände in Germany. But it also means to link up with those communities that try to create ecological solutions and promote a vision of a different society. Here we can contribute with the understanding that even if you find very creative ecological solutions in Europe and North America, it will continue to be a militarized society as long as we keep the majority of the resources, energy, and consumption of the world, despite only being about 20% of the population of the world. Every ecological program needs to have a global justice perspective, or we will become even more militarized in our treatment of migrants and access to those resources that will for sure become even more scarce in future. I think what we have that is unique is knowledge of how to struggle against the most hardcore dimension of the state, the military. We have therefore more than most developed a range of strategies and tactics that are vital and necessary to refine and spread to other movements. And here I'm thinking about the tradition and practices of nonviolent direct action. I think that is something which we can be part of, not because we are the only ones carrying that, of course, that's so spread around in the world, but we have a long tradition of that. With trainings, with the thinking around prefiguration, which comes from Gandhi's constructive program, these kind of things we can develop and we can contribute to, and we can also contribute in the way of people seeing how the militarist ideology is kind of informing so much of different aspects of our societies. So we have something to contribute, but we also have something really necessary to do, and that is to connect to these other struggles and not mobilize only around wars and against wars, but actually connect to the root causes of what creates wars in this global apartheid world we live in. All right, that's me.